Summary of A Voyage to Brobdingnag from Part 2 of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Written by Ohidur. Part 2, Chapters 1. 2 months after returning to England, Gulliver is restless again, sets sail on a ship called the Adventure, traveling to the Cape of Good Hope and Madagascar before encountering a monsoon drawing the ship off coast. Ship eventually arrives at an unknown land mass, no inhabitants about, and the landscape is barren and rocky. Walking back to the boat, sees, already left without him, tries to chase after it, but then sees, a giant is following the boat, runs away, stops, on a steep hill, can see the countryside, is shocked to see, grass is about 20 feet high, walks down what looks like a high road but turns out to be a footpath through a field of barley, walks for a long time but cannot see anything beyond the stalks of corn, which are 40 feet high, tries to climb a set of steps into the next field, but cannot mount them because too high, trying to climb up the stairs, sees another giant inhabitant, hides but it calls for more people to come, and begin to harvest the crop with scythes, lies down and bemoans his state, thinking about how insignificant he must be to these giant creatures. One servant comes close with both his foot and his scythe, so Gulliver screams as loudly as he can. Giant finally notices, picks up between fingers to get a closer look. Gulliver tries to speak to him in plaintive tones, bringing his hands together, and the giant seems pleased, makes it clear fingers are hurting him, and the giant places him in his pocket and begins to walk toward his master. Giant's master. The farmer takes Gulliver from his servant and observes him more closely, asks the other servants if they have ever seen anything like Gulliver, then places him onto the ground, sit around in a circle. Gulliver kneels down and begins to speak as loudly as he can, taking off his hat and bowing to the farmer, presents a purse full of gold. Farmer takes into his palm, cannot figure out what it is, even after Gulliver empties the coins into his hand, takes Gulliver back to his wife, who is frightened of him. Servant brings in dinner, and all sit down to eat, Gulliver sitting on the table not far from the farmer's plate. They give him tiny bits of their food, and he pulls out his knife and fork to eat, which delights the giant's son picks up and scares him. But the farmer takes Gulliver from the boy's hands and strikes his son. Gulliver makes a sign, boy should be forgiven, and kisses his hand. After dinner, wife lets Gulliver nap in her own bed, wakes up, finds 2 rats attacking him, and he defends himself with his hanger, or sword. Summary, Chapter 2. Farmer's 9-year-old daughter, whom Gulliver calls Glumdalclitch, or nursemaid, has a doll's cradle that becomes Gulliver's permanent bed. Glumdalclitch places the cradle inside a drawer to keep Gulliver safe from the rats, becomes Gulliver's caretaker and guardian, sewing clothes for him and teaching him the giant's language. Farmer begins to talk about Gulliver in town, and a friend of the farmer's comes to see him, looks at Gulliver through his glasses, and Gulliver begins to laugh at the sight of the man's eyes through the glass. Man becomes angry and advises to take Gulliver into the market to display him, agrees, and Gulliver is taken to town in a carriage very uncomfortable, placed on a table while Glumdalclitch sits down on a stool beside him, with 30 people at a time walking through as he performs tricks. Exhausted by the journey to the marketplace, but upon returning to the farmer's house, finds, to be shown there as well, people come from miles around and are charged great sums to view him, thinking, Gulliver can make him a great fortune. The farmer takes him and Glumdalclitch on a trip to the largest cities. -3 arrive in the largest city, Brobdingnag, and the farmer rents a room with a table for displaying Gulliver. By now, Gulliver can understand their language and speak it fairly well, shown 10 times a day and pleases the visitors greatly. Summary, Chapter 3. Strain of traveling and performing tricks takes its toll on Gulliver, and he begins to grow very thin. Farmer notices Gulliver's condition and resolves to make as much money as possible before Gulliver dies. Meanwhile, an order comes from the court, commanding the farmer to bring Gulliver to the Queen for her entertainment. Queen is delighted with Gulliver's behavior and buys him from the farmer for 1,000 gold pieces. Gulliver requests, Glumdalclitch be allowed to live in the palace as well, explains his suffering to the queen, and she is impressed by his intelligence. She takes him to the king, who at first thinks he is a mechanical creation. He sends for great scholars to observe Gulliver, and they decide, unfit for survival, since there is no way he could feed himself. Gulliver tries to explain, comes from a country in which everything is in proportion to himself, but they do not seem to believe him. Glumdalclitch is given an apartment in the palace and a governess to teach her, and special quarters are built for Gulliver out of a box. They also have clothes made for him from fine silk, but Gulliver finds them very cumbersome, awkward because of being large, heavy or not effective. Queen grows quite accustomed to his company, finding him very entertaining at dinner, especially when he cuts and eats his meat. He finds her way of eating repulsive, since her size allows her to swallow huge amounts of food in a single gulp, to eat or drink food or liquid quickly by swallowing it in large amounts, or to make a swallowing movement because of fear, surprise or excitement. King converses with Gulliver on issues of politics, and laughs at his descriptions of the goings-on in Europe, finds it amusing. People of such small stature should think themselves so important, and Gulliver is at first offended, then comes to realize, too has begun to think of his world as ridiculous. Queen's dwarf is not happy with Gulliver, since used to being the smallest person in the palace and a source of diversion for the royal court, drops Gulliver into a bowl of cream, but Gulliver is able to swim to safety. Dwarf is punished, at another point, sticks Gulliver into a marrow bone, where forced to remain until someone pulls him out. Summary, Chapter 4. Gulliver describes the geography of Brobdingnag, noting first, since the land stretches out about 6,000 miles, there must be a severe error in European maps. Kingdom is bounded on one side by mountains and on the other 3 sides by the sea. Water is so rough, no trade with other nations. Rivers are well stocked with giant fish, but the fish in the sea are of the same size as those in the rest of the world, and therefore not worth catching. Gulliver is carried around the city in a special traveling box, and people always crowd around to see him, asks to see the largest temple in the country and is not overwhelmed by its size, since at a height of 3,000 feet it is proportionally smaller than the largest steeple in England. Summary, Chapter 5. Gulliver is happy in Brobdingnag except for the many mishaps that befall him because of his diminutive size. In one unpleasant incident, the dwarf, angry at Gulliver for teasing him, shakes an apple tree over his head. One apple strikes Gulliver in the back and knocks him over. Another time, is left outside during a hailstorm and is so bruised and battered, cannot leave the house for 10 days. Gulliver and his nursemaid are often invited to the apartments of the ladies of the court. He is treated as a plaything of little significance. They enjoy stripping his clothes and placing him in their bosoms, and is appalled by their strong smell, noting, a Lilliputian told him, smelled quite repulsive. Women also strip their own clothes in front of him, and he finds their skin extremely ugly and uneven. Queen orders a special boat to be built for Gulliver, is placed in a cistern, a container in which water is stored, especially one connected to a toilet or in the roof of a house, and Gulliver rows in it for his own enjoyment and for the amusement of the Queen and her court. Yet another danger arises in the form of a monkey, which takes Gulliver up a ladder, holding him like a baby and force-feeding him, is rescued from the monkey, and Glumdalclitch tries to find out private facts about a person, the food from his mouth with a needle, after which Gulliver vomits, so weak and bruised an injury or mark where the skin has not been broken but is darker in color, often as a result of being hit by something, stays in bed for 2 weeks, monkey is killed and orders are sent out. No other monkeys be kept in the palace. Summary, Chapter 6. He said, knew no reason why those who entertain opinions prejudicial to the public should be obliged to change, or should not be obliged to conceal them. Gulliver makes himself a comb from the stumps of hair left after the king has been shaved, also collects hairs from the king and uses them to weave the backs of 2 small chairs, which he gives to the Queen as curiosities, is brought to a musical performance, but so loud, can hardly make it out. decides to play the spinet, an early type of musical instrument played like a piano for the royal family, but must contrive a novel way to do it, since the instrument is so big, uses large sticks and runs over the keyboard with them, but can still strike only 16 keys. Thinking, King has unjustly come to regard England as insignificant and laughable, Gulliver tries to tell him more about England, describing the government and culture. The King asks many questions and is particularly struck by the violence of the history Gulliver describes, then takes Gulliver into his hand and, explaining, he finds the world Gulliver describes to be ridiculous, contemptuous, and strange, tells him, he concludes, most Englishmen sound like odious vermin, small animals and insects that can be harmful and which are difficult to control when they appear in large numbers. I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Summary, Chapter 7. Gulliver is disturbed by the King's evaluation of England, tries to tell him about gunpowder, describing it as a great invention and offering it to the King as a gesture of friendship. King is appalled by the proposal, and Gulliver is taken aback, thinking, King has refused a great opportunity, thinks, King is unnecessarily scrupulous and narrow-minded for not being more open to the inventions of Gulliver's world. Gulliver finds the people of Brobdingnag in general to be ignorant and poorly educated. Laws are not allowed to exceed in words the number of letters in their alphabet, and no arguments may be written about them. They know the art of printing but do not of many books, and their writing is simple and straightforward. One text describes the insignificance and weakness of Brobdingnagians and even argues, at one point they must have been much larger. Summary, Chapter 8. Gulliver wants to recover freedom. King orders any small ship to be brought to the city, hoping they might find a woman with whom Gulliver can propagate. Gulliver fears any offspring thus produced would be kept in cages or given to the nobility as pets. Has been in Brobdingnag for 2 years and wants to be among his own kind again. Gulliver is taken to the south coast, and both Glumdalclitch and Gulliver fall ill. Gulliver says, wants fresh air, and a page carries him out to the shore in his traveling box, asks to be left to sleep in his hammock, and the boy wanders off. An eagle grabs hold of Gulliver's box and flies off with him, and then suddenly Gulliver feels himself falling and lands in the water, worries, will drown or starve to death, but then feels the box being pulled, hears a voice telling him, his box is tied to a ship and a carpenter will come to drill a hole in the top. Gulliver says, they can simply use a finger to pry it open, and hears laughter, realizes, is speaking to people of his own height and climbs a ladder out of his box and onto their ship. Gulliver begins to recover on the ship, and tries to tell the sailors the story of his recent journey, shows them things he saved from Brobdingnag, like his comb and a tooth pulled from a footman, has trouble adjusting to the sailors' small size, and finds himself shouting all the time. Reaches home, takes him some time to grow accustomed to his old life, and his wife asks him to never go to sea again. The writer is Assistant Professor of English and Director, Language Center, University of Information Technology and Sciences. Please consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching.